So welcome. This is governance and education. So firstly, I'll start off with a quote from Gordon Tate from his book titled Making Sense of Mass Education. And he says, modern school isn't just a place about education, but has a big role to play within contemporary governance. In this seminar, I will seek to bring to light the changing contexts of government within education and how this ultimately relates to you, the teacher, and your role. We will also reflect on how these current forms of governance are used to shape present-day social administration. So firstly, let's look at the layers of governance. These layers of governance, as it echoes down to you in its simplest of forms. So we have government, then the education industry, down to the schools, and then into your classroom. So as teachers, we are guided by different sectors, like the academic community, who are interested in our future improvements of teaching and learning. Whereas we have also the political community, and they are driven by results-led agendas to measure performance and success rates of students, teachers, and their schools. And we can see this in the NAPLAN testing. So NAPLAN testing we can see here, and we can also see it with the publication of the NAPLAN results to the My School website. So this is high stakes testing, and it is very attractive for policymakers and politicians in a global economic climate. This production of statistics and systems uses data or results data to steer or manage practices, individuals and institutions from a distance. And it is at this convenience of this setup of governance that contrasts where we have come from as a society when we were once a mob. So here we see we were once a mob and we were governed by a sovereign rule, which was directed basically by their own purpose, what the sovereign wanted to do. And so they would ride into town every once in a while and they would control the society directly. So now we have a population and we have it governed by a government who have a new form of social regulation and management. And that works directly and sometimes indirectly, as this example of NAPLAN does show an indirect way of social regulation and management. So this political agenda of management and accountability was viewed by a man named Paulo Freire. He was a 20th century educational thinker and theorist, and he argued that education and politics are effectively linked. So Freire viewed all educational activity as a political act, particularly emphasizing the strong bond between education and power. So this active intervention role of governance has brought a new culture to our profession of teaching. This is with the delivery of outcomes, accountability, and performance, which is different from the past, when teachers back then were awarded a high degree of autonomy. And this concept of accountability and performance within the school to the ideology of disciplinary management through the use of consistent surveillance and the regulation of time, space and conduct. And this in its essence is a shift to self-governance. And here we see an ever-increasing demands on schools these days, their boards, the educational administrators and teaching staff, to ensure the highest standards of governance and compliance is followed. So this website, schoolgovernance.net.au, is a great website that actually goes into the legal and regulatory compliances that schools are dealing with on a regular basis, and ultimately you, the teacher, are as well. So now I'd just like to highlight perhaps what you are actually needing to focus on, or your regulations that you're working with, as I said, on a daily basis. So here we see the legal and regulatory compliance that you're complying with. So things like your registration standards, the national quality standards, you're adhering to duty of care, workplace safety, privacy, child protection, code of conduct, excursions, responsible persons, record-keeping policies, vocational training. So it's quite a lot, and we can see from this slide that teachers themselves may not need to know the legislations inside and out. This is usually the job of the educational administrator or the principal, or sometimes there is someone who's employed separately to handle all this compliance. But as teachers, our profession requires us to know the basics of this legislation, and some in more depth than others. So we are still accountable, and we are required to answer for the decisions we make, or at least have the mechanisms in place to adhere to all the applicable standards. So we need to be proactive in seeking information that helps us govern our classroom. So within the modern institution of schools, self-governance in this form takes a threefold process, and that is individualisation, differentiation, and normalisation. Forging a model of social governance, regulating and shaping acceptable citizens, and if one steps out, what we consider is acceptable behaviour, we can put a plan into place and we can adjust and recalibrate. So think about it. That's what the government is doing with social governance. I'd like you to think about, is this what you do in your classroom? And how does the broader perspective of social governance help you micromanage your children? Is this not that we have regulations put into place that are acceptable and sort of wanted behaviour of our students? And this is what this slide presents. So when you step into your classroom tomorrow, I would like you to stop and reflect about what are the characteristics of a certain type of citizen that you are educating, or shall I cheekily say, helping to produce. What characteristics do you consider acceptable for model citizens? I'd like you to make a list. I'll start you off. Here we can also see the similarities of this process of collecting data to help differentiate one person or a child from another. And Gordon Tate so shrewdly calls this the process of filling the folder. I'd now like to look at this slide and talk about the statistics and the census data that is essential for policymakers. So policies are about programs, behaviour and conduct. Statistics serve as an important tool for identifying forms of social, demographic and economic inclusions. These factors help with decision making and allocating funding. So the government uses this to decipher what and who we are targeting. I guess this is much like the data collection in your classroom. So testing and recording forms a basis of identifying characteristics and the skills, the capacities and the weaknesses of people. Then we can differentiate from peers. And from here we can find a normal curve and we can use this as a measure. So I'd really like to stop here, and I would like you to reflect on your and your colleagues' record keeping at your workplace. And I'd like you to focus on the initial moment that a parent makes an inquiry to send their child to your school. So once they have decided to send their child to your school, this is where the data collection of that child starts, at the application of just general information. And I would like you to make a simple STEM map like this one, filling it in, as the paper trail. I guess the data collection or the record keeping about this child who is educated in your class. So have a really good think about all the things that you collect on that child. So if I gave you the folder, list all the information that you would use to fill it up as this child journeys through your classroom or your school. So we could probably pinpoint a moment in time of that child's life where he or she had fallen over and perhaps needed some medical attention from you, which you would require to fill out an incident report and therefore have a parent sign. So all of these are filed, and we could pinpoint this over the time that that child is with you, and it may be several years. So there's a lot to do with the paper trail. So now that we have collected this data and we have measured peer against peer in our classroom, we can now as teachers analyse and document the shortcomings. We can document shortcomings and we can start any forms of intervention that is necessary. And this process is called normalisation, basically shaping society. In the community, assessment through this normalisation process is sought to efficiently manage social administration. So the government is seeking to regulate the population, for example, through protection, child abuse, through punishment, prison, or economic benefit, to distribute resources such as social welfare, for example. Seeing now teachers are being taught to identify any antisocial behaviours within the school, with any early warning signs of this antisocial behaviour. In all classrooms across Australia, we see the teacher now being responsible for the process of diagnosis, treatment and intervention, which is huge. Learning, personality and conduct disorders are now identified, categorised and normalised, and this is a daily, termly and yearly occurrence in schools. So it is not uncommon for teachers to collaborate with special education teachers, psychologists, social workers, dealing with counselling, paediatrics, psychology, pharmacology, and the list could probably go on. So again, a far different business from our previous predecessors. Is this all about the education, I ask? Or are we being relied on to shape acceptable personalities and conditions of conduct within these children? These are perhaps future employable citizens. To me, it seems that this is no norm, and it's almost been programmed into our contemporary pedagogy psyche. So I'd just like to do a little personal reflection on my first week of school this year in kindergarten where I work. And after reflecting, this is how I felt. I was unconsciously examining the children with this checklist in my head. And I was noting down attributes, or basically categorizing these children as I was watching them. Yep, he needs speech. Oh, yep, look at that motor. That's a little bit of behavior that I'll need to look at. And I stopped and sort of reflected after a while. And to me, I was wondering, does this form the foundations of a good practice? So instead of focusing on what children's weaknesses were and perhaps looking at any opportunity to provide any intervention, perhaps I should have been more heavily focused on starting the recording process on what children can do and their achievements. So what I'm trying to say is this is perhaps a modern human trait. In this modern world, we seek to narrow down and our different groups to help us control and plan and record progression. And it's something that what we do in our classroom to help us keep that control over all the different children and all the different levels. I guess you can look at this, it's much like the government, looking at all the different people in society with all the different levels, etc. So as teachers, we need to be aware of, this reflection process on our practices, and we need to routinely scrutinise our shortages. So now I'd just like to bring your attention to something that happened last year in our school and that of many schools, because the Australian government actually started a federally funded, nationally consistent collection of data, school students with disability. And this is a data collection that they're requiring us to do every year from now on. And it reinforces the existing obligations that teachers have and schools have towards students under the Commonwealth Disability Discrimination Act of 1992 and the Disability Standards of Education of 2005. So basically the government is seeking to count the number of students who require active monitoring or provision of low-level supports on an annual basis. So basically, teachers were asked to look at their students and identify children who would fall under the broad definition of disability. And it is a broader definition now. Disability not so long ago was a little bit more severe. So these disabilities perhaps might be as simple as a vision process. Not someone who particularly needed glasses, because there wouldn't be any classroom adjustments that would step outside a normal teacher's requirements of perhaps positioning that child so they can see the book at the front of the class or the blackboard, for example. So anyone who required adjustment with the classroom and had a functional impact on their schooling, they were asked to identify and show what supports that they were giving for these students with these disabilities. So it was quite a lot of work to do, and it will happen on a yearly basis. The categories were under physical, cognitive, sensory, and social emotional. So here this shows that this form of labelling or classifying of students is really commonplace in the modern classroom. We are required to do this under governmental law and regulation. And we are identifying a greater range of educational difficulties and differences and classifying them. This categorical approach to providing help has been roundly criticised by many educators who claim that labelling a student does more harm than good. So now I would actually like to look at the process of labelling. So does classification process alter the school experience for a student? And if diagnosed, does one receive better or more appropriate care? So these are some questions I ask when I looked at the advantages and the disadvantages of labelling. And I'd like you to do this activity just to sit down and to think about what are some of those advantages of labelling a child and some of the disadvantages. It could be in relation to you in the classroom. It could be in relation to the child and their experience or their future experience. It could even be related to the families if you would like. So finally, we see here the interrelationship between governance and education on the basis of effectively governing individuals throughout all schools. This is education at a mass proportion. This is a huge amount of the society. It's by seeking an overabundance of data, not only on the individual students, but monitoring and measuring the support of teachers and schools. So ultimately, it's shaping and managing the conduct of perhaps the population to emerge.